Okay. Good day, everyone. My name is Gustav Tungren, and on behalf of the Earth System Governance Project, I would like to welcome you to the third ESG speaker series of 2021, titled Achieving the SDGs in Times of COVID-19, which will be the topic of a roundtable discussion with a selection of distinguished experts in the field. If this is the first time you engage with the Earth System Governance Project, let me provide you with a short introduction. We are the largest social science research network in the area of governance and global environmental change. We are a pluralistic and vibrant research community that encourages collaborations among a global network of scholars and hosts a stimulating annual conference each year. If you are engaged in similar research, I encourage you to consider applying to become a research fellow. We organized this ESG speaker series to provide a platform for the ongoing research, discussion, and output from scholars of the Earth System Governance Project. Fellows of the network propose the topics and lead the dialogue of this series. Today's session is co-hosted together with the GlobalGoals project, a 5-year research project which is based at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University and is endorsed by the Earth System Governance Project. This ESG speaker series event is also special. It marks the launch of the Earth System Governance Task Force on the Sustainable Development Goals. Our task forces are collaborative efforts in which interdisciplinary scholars come together, seeking to push the frontiers of research in areas aligned to this Earth System Governance Science and Implementation Plan. The Task Force on Sustainable Development Goals aims to advance this scientific understanding of governance by global goals, and in particular, the steering effect of the Sustainable Development Goals. To achieve this aim, the task force will build, invigorate, and lead a diverse research community, developing a forum for exchanging cutting-edge research and policy studies on to what extent and under what conditions governance through goals can be effective. The first meeting of this group will take place on 10th September at the Task Force Meeting Day at the 2021 Bratislava Conference on Earth System Governance. Soon, on behalf of the Earth System Governance Project, we're delighted to see this task force forming and look forward to seeing its future collaboration and forthcoming research. If you're interested to get involved in the task force, we will host an informal Zoom meeting get-together after the webinar for those who wish to connect further. We will post a link in the chat towards the end of the webinar for this purpose. Soon, we will focus our attention to the main event of the evening, a roundtable discussion about the challenges and opportunities related to the achievement of the SDGs in times of COVID-19. 4 distinguished speakers are joining us to discuss this question. We have Andrea Ordonez Llanos, Director of Southern Voice, a network of 51 think tanks from the Global South that promotes and disseminates research from the South on sustainable development goals. Our next speaker is Åsa Persson, Research Director and Deputy Director of the Stockholm Environment Institute and Scientific Steering Committee member of the Earth System Governance Project. Her research focuses on global governance, including the implementation of the SDGs, specifically looking at policy integration and coherence across the goals. In 2020, she was appointed by the UN Secretary General to the independent group of scientists to draft the 2023 UN Global Sustainable Development Report. Our third speaker is Joseph Alcamo, Director of the Sussex Sustainability Research Program at University of Sussex. Later in July this year, this program will host an online symposium titled Evidence for Action, Aligning the Climate and SDG Agendas. Joseph also leads a multifaceted research effort to provide science for the SDGs. Our last panelist is Frank Biermann, Director of the GlobalGoals project at Utrecht University and co-convener of the ESG SDG Task Force, as well as founder and former chair of the Earth System Governance Project. In turn, the roundtable discussion will be led by moderators Caroline Sinnett and Thomas Hickman, both researchers at the GlobalGoals project and Utrecht University. Before we dig into the discussion, I will pass the word over to Frank Biermann, who will present the SDG Impact Assessment which will be released in early 2022 as part of the Earth System Governance book series with Cambridge University Press. Frank, the floor is yours. Thank you all.
Can you see my slides, Gustav?
I can, Frank. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gustav. And thanks, everybody, for being here and listening to our discussions today on the steering effects of the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to briefly introduce into the Earth System Governance Project's efforts in studying the Sustainable Development Goals. Before, just for those of you who might not have been engaged with the SDGs so far, a brief introduction in the topic. The Sustainable Development Goals were agreed upon by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015. It's a broad set of 17 large goals with 169 more specific targets. They range from a variety of topics: no hunger, no poverty, increasing health, better education, gender equality, renewable energy, down to climate action, down to protecting life on Earth, life on land, peace and justice, better institutions. So a variety of issues is being covered by these 17 goals and their 169 targets. And they all are to be achieved according to the vision of the United Nations General Assembly by 2030. These goals, or this approach of global governance by setting goals, is in many ways different from traditional approaches in global governance. These goals are not legally binding. So they're not part of international law. They're not like international treaties that are binding upon nations. They are also in many ways qualitative and therefore difficult to assess. It's very difficult to really understand to what extent countries and other actors will have achieved these goals over time. The goals are integrative in a way that they are covering both the industrialized countries and the developing countries, global north and global south. And in this respect, they are different from the earlier Millennium Development Goals that are largely focusing on the concerns of the global south. And then these goals are also all-encompassing. They are covering almost all activities that human people can ever do, from a variety of issues affecting ecological, social, and economic systems. So the big question is, of course, for the research community, to what extent will these goals actually work? Will these goals really change the way how we function in our societies? Will they change the way how governments function? Will they change the way how the United Nations function? Will they have any effect in the next 10 years on our societies? And to understand this question is the Earth System Governance Project, and many of us came together and organized what became the SDG Midterm Impact Assessment, which is a study program, an assessment program by which more than 60 researchers together assessed a large body of literature that has been published so far in the last 5 years on the steering effects of the SDGs, trying to understand what do we know so far on the effects that the SDGs had in the last 5-6 years. And this is an assessment that has been done, is still under process, and will be published in March 2022 by Cambridge University Press. And I run through now 6 slides on the 6 main questions that the SDG midterm impact assessment is set out to answer. The first question that we are trying to understand in our research program, in this assessment program, is the impact that the SDGs had so far on global governance. To what extent do we find any changes in global governance, in the United Nations system, international institutions that can be attributed to the SDGs? Is anything different in the global governance system because United Nations have agreed on the SDGs in 2015? The second question that we want to analyze in our research and our assessment are the impacts that the SDGs had so far on national political systems in the global north, in the global south, in subnational political systems such as in provinces, in regions, in cities, in local communities, in companies, businesses, and civil society, universities, communities. We want to know to what extent we can trace down any changes to the better in these different national and subnational actor systems, and try to understand to what extent the SDGs had any positive steering effects at subnational level. This is our second question in the assessment. And the third question that we are posing in our assessment that we try to answer is the question of integration and the interlinkages of the various variety of SDGs. So the SDGs were meant to bring together a variety of actors, but also a variety of policy domains. They were meant to institutionally integrate economic, ecological, and social policies. They were meant to bring together international actors, national actors, subnational actors, and align them all following this ambitious agenda of the 17 SDGs. And we wanted to know whether this has actually happened, whether they can find any integrative effects that the SDGs had so far in the last 5 years on these actors. This is our third question. The fourth question is about inclusiveness. The SDG agenda, the 2015 agenda, has a very, very ambitious language in terms of global inclusiveness. It says that no one will be left behind. It says that it's meant to protect the interest of the global poor and the most vulnerable people and bring together the global community around an inclusiveness and pro-poor agenda. And what we want to know is to what extent the SDGs actually had any positive effect on this question. Do we find since 2015 any indications for more inclusive governance systems at the national level and the local level in support of the poor and the vulnerable communities? And internationally, do we observe any better integration, better inclusiveness, and better support of vulnerable countries in international institutions? And then, of course, to the extent that we might find such changes, can any of these changes be attributed to the SDGs? Are there any steering effects of the SDGs that we can identify so far? This is our fourth question. Now coming to the fifth question, we are very interested in the way in which the SDGs are protecting the integrity, planetary integrity of our entire Earth system in terms of protection of climate, biodiversity, and many other important ecological systems of our planet, and to what extent the SDGs had any steering effects in reshaping economic policies, energy, settlements, and many other economic policy domains in a way that they become more sustainable, in a way that they're more aligned with the concerns and the importance of our planetary system. So here we want to understand to what extent the SDGs had any positive effect so far on the planetary integrity in the last 5 years. This is our fifth question. And the sixth question, the final question that we address in this assessment, is the question of research methods. What are the best methods? What are the methods that are used so far in studying the SDGs? And what are the best methods? What methods are promising? What methods are preferable to understand the steering effects that SDGs have in these questions? And also, we're looking at qualitative methodologies, we're looking at qualitative methodologies. Here, our question is also, to what extent can we best combine insights from quantitative and qualitative methodology? So this is our sixth sub-assessment that we have in our project. So these are 6 main questions, and we have worked for the last year in assessing the entire body of literature that has been published so far on these 6 questions. And our main findings will be presented over the next 12 months in a series of webinars and eventually published by Cambridge University Press in March 2022. But the work will not be over. So it's clear that this work and this assessment is, we believe, very important. And we also believe that with this one assessment, the midterm assessment, we are not done yet with our research. So therefore, we have contacted the Earth System Governance Project, and we're very happy that the Earth System Governance Project agreed to set up a task force of researchers, a long-term task force of researchers on assessing the Sustainable Development Goals. That means to continue our research program. And this task force is open to anybody. So if you are out there, you're interested in studying the steering effects of the SDGs from a social science perspective, from a governance perspective, you're very welcome to join our community. We want to bring together senior and early career researchers from all over the world to study these important questions. You can contact us, it's all on the website also. We have an email address, sdg@earthsystemgovernance.org. You can stay in touch by following us on Twitter in ESG_SDG. We have a website with more information. We will add on this information, we will add more information over time. And again, this is very much an open process. You can email us. It's convened by Thomas Hickmann, Karl Ansedin, Jijan Zürn, and myself. And we try to bring together this community and make it as open, as global, and as inclusive as possible. And we have a timeline for that. And the timeline is that we have today the official launch of this task force. I'm very grateful for the distinguished speakers to join us after this presentation in discussing certain aspects of SDGs. On the 25th of May, we will have the next webinar, which will zoom in on the question of global governance and SDGs. And then we follow with a series of webinars. In June, we will have a webinar on implementation, national implementation, and the impacts of SDGs at the country level. And on the 20th and 22nd of July, there will be a very important online symposium hosted by the University of Sussex together with many partners, including the University of Utrecht, on evidence for action, aligning the climate and SDG agendas. And Joe Alcamo, who is here on this panel, will maybe talk a little bit more because he is hosting this event at the University of Sussex. But of course, it will be technically an online symposium where anybody can participate wherever you are based. 7th to 9th September is the Bratislava Conference on Earth System Governance, which might also be, well, will be most likely also online. And on the 10th of September, we will have the first large open meeting of the SDG Task Force. So if you're interested, join us on the 10th of September on the Task Force Day of the Bratislava Conference. We will have a meeting of this task force where we all try to bring together this community. And then September, October, November, December, we continue with a webinar series on these questions that I have outlined, on the interlinkages, on inclusiveness, on planetary integrity, on methods of studying SDG impacts. And then in March 2022, we will have the big party, I hope, in which the book will be released. The SDG Midterm Impact Assessment will be published by Cambridge University Press, and it will be published as an open access book. That means in March 2022, you can just download the entire book and all its chapters for free from the website of Cambridge University Press without paying anything. It's all for free. The lovers of book can also buy the book in a physical version, but I recommend just download the entire thing from the website in March 2022 when we are done. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you much for participating in this event. And also, I hope very much that some of you might be interested in joining the SDG task force of the Earth System Governance Project and joining our discussion, joining the webinar, listening to the webinar series that we have, the conference that Joe Alcamo and his team is organizing in July, the Bratislava conference in September. And I hope that some of you might also want to download for free the book that will come out in March 2022 on the SDG midterm assessment that we have organized. Thank you so much for your attention, and I am closing now the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. So many activities going on. I mean, this is really exciting, and in my view, a testament of the growing interests for this line of research within and beyond our community. My name is Caroline Sennett, and I have the great honor today to moderate with my colleague Thomas Hickmann the first GlobalGoals webinar series, which is dedicated today to achieving the SDGs in pandemic times. In the past few months, we have seen vaccination rates progressing, at least in the global north. But despite this progress, the COVID-19 pandemic is still an unresolved global crisis with huge impacts on our daily lives, and especially on those of the poorest who struggle to meet their basic needs. So over the span of a year, the pandemic and its socioeconomic consequences have made it clear that the largest challenges of humanity cannot be dealt with in isolation. So our question is today, can and will the integrated normative framework of the Sustainable Development Goals bring much needed guidance for building back better? Andrea, Elsa, Joseph, and Frank are here with us today to discuss this question. Thank you all again for joining. But before we begin, here are some notes on housekeeping. So as you may know by now, only panelists, chair, and moderators' videos and audio are available, but the Q&A and chat box is open to all. The panel of speakers will address questions from the audience, your questions, after a first round of questions by Thomas and me. To ask a question, use the Q&A button on the lower part of your screen. And if you wish to direct your question at a certain speaker, write their name and then the question. You can upvote a question of another audience member if you like it and would like it to see answered. And there will be, as Gustav mentioned, an informal Zoom get-together after the webinar for those who wish to connect with the Earth System Governance Project and find more information about the Earth System Governance Task Force on the Sustainable Development Goals. We will post a link in the chat towards the end of the webinar. And now I'm extremely happy to kickstart the discussion with our panelists. I would invite you to turn on your videos. So one thing that we have learned from the pandemic is that while it has hit the whole world, its consequences are particularly devastating for poorer and often already disadvantaged groups and regions. In other words, I think we can confidently say that the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities within and between countries. Andrea, you're leading the Southern Voice Network, which has recently launched a COVID-19 digital knowledge hub that compiles research from countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America on the impact that the pandemic is having on those regions and how it specifically affects the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you tell us a bit about the main findings of this initiative and specifically to what extent is the Global South particularly affected by such a multifaceted crisis, and can the SDGs play a role at all in addressing it? Andrea.
Thank you, Caroline, and good morning, everybody. I'm connecting from Ecuador, so we're in the morning here. As Caroline said, my remarks will bring together some of the findings that you can find in our digital knowledge hub that contains over 700 resources of analysis, commentary, and research from our network of think tanks across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we've been synthesizing and analyzing all these resources to see where are the concerns from the regions where our members are based. And definitely the issue of vulnerabilities, new and pre-existing vulnerabilities is key in the agenda of researchers across the Global South. I think first there is, of course, the in-country inequalities and gaps. And I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw these more and more be played out globally. And we saw that vulnerable groups, independent of whether they were more developed countries, least developed countries, middle-income countries, we saw these different vulnerabilities play out and be central, right? And this was because it was a new crisis and a lack of preparedness for it. Of course, these groups were the first ones and hardest to get hit. So some of the issues around low-income groups, informal workers were critical at the very beginning. Gender gaps have also shown to be very critical. And there are also new vulnerabilities that have come up and that we will keep seeing in the future. The issue of education and having in many countries more than a year and a half with children out of school really takes us into thinking about the inequalities in different perspectives, not only about among children and adolescents in different economic groups or different countries, but across generations, right? We will have a whole generation that will have maybe 1-2 years without formal schooling, and it's quite hard to predict what would that entail later on. But like Caroline said, it's not only, I think, about these initial vulnerabilities and gaps that we saw very early on, when I think we are all feeling a little bit the pandemic in a similar way. I think that now the concerns about the inequality are moving from the discussions of gaps within countries and specific groups to what is going to happen between countries. And I think that the question now will be about which are the countries that will be left behind. And Caroline mentioned the comment on vaccination and progress made in the global north, and the significant problems that we have in this respect in the global south, and very differently across regions. The issues of vaccination are very different, but I think this is a little bit of the evolution of the issue of inequalities. We've seen first a focus on domestic inequalities, in-group inequalities. I think we will be seeing more issues related to inequalities within countries, and the questions that will start to become more critically, which will be the countries, the regions that will be left behind at the end as well. And to your question of the role of the SDGs, I think that one of the things that that we've seen, and that I can come back to later a little bit more in detail, is that the SDGs have a very strong focus, many indicators, and the ones that are better planned and that are more clearly measured are at the individual level, right? Are about individual capacities and so on. And I think that the COVID-19 crisis shows that this is not enough, and that we really need to be thinking in more collective level capabilities and system level capabilities, productive capabilities, technological capabilities, and so on. And I think this is a major gap that the SDGs has, and that has come up now more clearly with the pandemic, and that will be a limitation for its role moving forward.
Thanks, Andrea, for your question. It was a good start. I would like to continue now with a question to Åsa Persson from the Stockholm Environment Institute. And it's about next year, because next year will, as many of you know, mark the 50th anniversary of the United Nations First World Conference on the Environment. And the Swedish government is preparing to host a high-level political meeting in Stockholm, Stockholm plus 50, with the proposed overarching theme on a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity. So what can we expect, Åsa, from this meeting in such uncertain times? And do you think that it can, to some extent, revive multilateralism?
Thank you very much, Thomas. And thank you for inviting me. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but I wanted to share some of my thoughts and analysis. I think, what can we expect? I guess I am a bit torn, both low and high expectations. Above all, this pandemic has shown us really how unpredictable sort of life and politics can be. And we need to be a bit humble. We know, as a direct effect, of course, for these global sustainability governance meetings, it has really compressed the calendar. We have postponed big biodiversity and climate COPs. And it's not just about the meeting, but we actually don't know yet the outcome of these meetings. So what will be in place to build on at Stockholm Plus 50 in June next year? Also going virtual in these types of meetings, we have seen a lot of innovation, and I think a lot of positive examples this year how it is actually feasible to have conversation and dialogue, and now with the US summit, also sort of countries making commitments in this virtual mode. It's definitely more inclusive, but also, to be honest, we haven't yet seen any hard negotiations take place online. So these are some reasons maybe to have low or moderate expectations. As Andrea said very, very illustratively, the world is in a state of crisis. Many vulnerable countries are struggling to have the bandwidth to sort of do other things beyond managing the pandemic, and that's very understandable. And also, if you, as a more structural reason, if you put away the timing question for a while, a structural reason, of course, we're in a very different place now compared with 50 years ago. We have a very dense institutional framework for global sustainable development and environmental governance. I don't know to tell this audience that there are many hundreds of multilateral environmental agreements, many thousands of voluntary initiatives. At the national level, big bureaucracies, institutions have been built up, etc. So we have many more layers in global governance, and I think really we're beyond that point where a single meeting can sort of, save the world or sort of pull all this together and provide that sort of one simple synthesis of how we're doing and what needs to be done. It's a collective effort, and we need to have many meetings, many voices. Simply, it's too big of a challenge. So again, these were a little bit to I think why we should have moderate or sort of manage our expectations. But I also think we should have, of course, high expectations. As what we know is that the Swedish government has announced they want to, if possible, highlight a few specific issues. One is green and inclusive recovery. And I think that could be really good timing to really assess, all these nice promises we have heard from world leaders. Have they actually delivered? We can assess. I think green jobs is an interesting issue to lift in this context as well. We see that bubbling in many countries. And it's very important for the young generation, which is now being more vocal. And a second priority topic that has been flagged is sustainable consumption and production. And I think it could be really interesting if this meeting could trigger a more systemic, a more transformative approach to this issue, which has been figuring for a long time before the SDGs, and now we have SDG 12. And I think this is also a very strong message coming out of major assessment like the Global Sustainable Development Report, the recent Make Peace with Nature report, which tried to synthesize all the IPCC, IPBES, GEO, big reports. So high expectations. I think I wanted to end here with also saying that I think we should have high expectations on the Stockholm Plus 50 moment, as opposed to a single meeting, because this is really, the world has been discussing, been trying to govern these issues for 50 years. It's, I think, a moment when this book that Frank mentioned is going to be released, many other books, reports. It's a moment to hold our leaders accountable, but I think also ourselves accountable, and how can we work more effectively as researchers as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elsa. We will surely follow up closely the preparations of this high-level meeting. Now let me turn to Joseph. Joseph, you have been extremely active in the international climate negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement, in particular as science special advisor to the UN head of climate negotiations, Christiana Figueres. Both the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015. Now, 6 years after this landmark year for global cooperation on sustainability issues, COVID-19 has distracted attention from the efforts to promote sustainable development and fight climate change. So in the face of shrinking resources during and after the pandemic, do you believe it is still possible to coordinate and align these two huge efforts, or must they compete for scarce resources?
Thank you very much for your question. It's been 6 years, huh? That's a long time. Amazing how time flies. Well, you asked whether it's possible. First, I think we should ask whether we should altogether align these two agendas. And then I would use as a departure point the fact that they're both really, really expensive. The world is spending about 500 billion per year on climate mitigation efforts. And a recent estimate from the UN is that the investment gap in the SDGs, just in the global south, is around $2.5 to $3 trillion per year. So for all of that expenditure, there is a lot of overlap and yet a lot of, I believe, duplicated effort. There's separate partnerships for climate and the SDGs. There's separate coordination bodies. There's separate negotiation threads. There are two separate industries, actually. So I would say that if we could possibly align these efforts, not necessarily combine them, but align them, we certainly have the opportunity to save resources, which Lord knows are really tight these days. Where I live in the UK, we just reduced foreign aid from 0.7% of the GNP down to 0.5%. That means billions of less money flowing to the global south over the next year or two at least. So the good news is that there are, I believe, lots of policies and measures that can achieve both climate goals and the SDGs. Don't have time to talk about the long list. Let's give you one example. It has to do with reducing post-harvest losses in agriculture. So we lose about 1/3 of the total food production in the world each year just because of the lack of storage facilities and the lack of adequate transport of the food to markets, right? Now, if we were able to reduce these post-harvest losses substantially, there's been literature studies that have said that we could save 2 million square kilometers of cropland. On the reduced area, we would be producing more food per area, securing food security, helping to advance SDG 2. And on the reduced area, we would need less fertilizer, which means less nitrous oxide emissions and other bad stuff going to the atmosphere. So one estimate is that we could reduce equivalent CO2 gases going into the atmosphere by 4.5 gigatons each year. Now, is that a big number? That's equivalent to the total emissions of greenhouse gases from Europe. So not bad. One of many, many different examples in agriculture, like scaling up agroforestry, like in the energy sector, in transportation and buildings, that would clearly advance both agendas, the goals of both climate and other SDGs. So we have a lot of opportunities, but then we get to the possible question. Is it possible to actually align these agendas? Well, first of all, we know that there are barriers. Sometimes we do climate policies and we end up working against SDGs. Think of the example in Bangladesh, where some projects that have been internationally financed to restore the mangroves along the coastline have literally led to land grabbing and open conflicts between large landowners and smallholders of agricultural land. A bit of a pity. You're trying to achieve some climate goals and really bashing against SDG 15, right? SDG 16, inequality. So the important point is we don't only need policies to combine climate and SDGs, but we need equitable and just policies. And how are we going to get them? I think we're going to get them by keeping in mind that the policies and implementation are context specific. Big policies, one size does not fit all, that we have to absolutely take a bottom-up inclusive approach and always engage the most vulnerable people in this policy development and implementation. And I think there are good examples of these equitable and just policies happening in the world. How are we going to align these agendas then? So a lot needs to be done. I think government has a role to play. For instance, the governments could align their COVID recovery packages with, to start with, the nationally determined contributions that they're supposed to carry out under the Paris Agreement, as well as the voluntary national reviews they're submitting to the UN under the SDGs. Try and align it with the official SDG and climate policies to see if they themselves could become aligned. NGOs could work with governments to try and leverage existing intergovernmental processes, and God knows there's lots of them, to include joint climate SDG policy. So what do I mean by that? So for example, under the Biodiversity Convention, the goals under that convention are now being updated. And it's, I think, a great opportunity to incorporate targets for food security and climate related to biodiversity under the new biodiversity regime, to come up with joint policies for climate and SDGs. And of course, the academic community can always make its contribution by providing technical assistance to countries to help them analyze climate SDG synergies, and to work with stakeholders on studies of climate SDG synergies at the local level. So I think there's a lot to be done, but also a lot to be gained by trying to align these two giant monsters of the SDG agenda and the climate agenda.
Well, thanks very much, Joseph, for these insights. Looking also forward to the conference in June. I would like to continue with the question to Frank, last but not least. And it's about the United Nations and the prospective role, because it seems that the pandemic has made one thing very clear, that only through global cooperation and solidarity we can fight the virus, and nobody seems to be safe until everyone is safe. But the response to the pandemic has shown a lack of cooperation and coordination among states, and also the weak and faded role of the United Nations. And this year, the high-level political forum on sustainable development focuses on the topic sustainable and resilient recovery from COVID-19. Do you think this event could bring the SDGs back and also the United Nations back in the game?
Well, I mean, starting with what we found about the international system and the high-level political forum in our research so far. I mean, this I didn't include in my presentation because we're not yet in the state to share all our research results. But it seems that the SDGs did not have a major impact on the system of international organizations and institutions so far. So there are indication literature that we have studied, and they will be laid out in the webinar on the 25th of May when we are discussing global governance and the SDGs. But it seems that the impact has been not very strong. It seems that the high-level political forum had not a major steering effect so far. And it seems that the changes are largely on the discursive level, if at all. So, I mean, the discourses are changing, but not necessarily the allocation of funding, the setting of rules. The entire hardware of global governance is not really following the SDGs so far. So therefore, the expectations for a strong steering role for the high-level political forum and other international organizations in the current setting is not very high, from my perspective. Let's put it on the optimistic way. I always try to be optimistic in many ways. So what is a positive part of the, what could we learn? What could be the positive changes of the COVID crisis? And I think one positive side could be a new vision about the role of government. I think after 20, 30 years of neoliberal breakdown of governmental agencies and governments as such, maybe the COVID crisis had led to a new understanding that governments and effective and just and fair governments are very important parts of any crisis response, COVID, but also, of course, of many others. And this might have led to a reconsideration of government. Number two, it might have led, and this you pointed out, Thomas, already quite rightly so, it might lead to a reconsideration of global cooperation, because COVID has shown that it is a global crisis. It's a major global crisis, and this is one, but we also have many other global crises. Joe has pointed to the climate agenda. So maybe the COVID crisis has helped shape a new understanding of the importance of global interdependence, global connectivity, and also then as a consequence of that, of global cooperation that might be strengthened and might be revisited by the COVID crisis. And the third optimistic part is maybe it has led also to a different way on how people see their own lives and how people see their own levels of consumption. Also mentioned sustainable consumption as one of the key areas in the Stockholm conference. And maybe COVID has changed for some people the way how they understand the necessity of an over-excessive, over-consumptive lifestyle. I don't know. This is a positive, it's an optimistic story. There are also, of course, many indications for the negative impacts of COVID beyond the pandemic as such, and Andrea has pointed some of them. So it is a half glass full, half glass empty story. But I believe, to answer your question quickly, that there might be a new case for stronger global cooperation, global governance afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank, for your answer, and thanks to the whole panel. We have now many questions from the floor. They all came in last minute, as always, but thanks for your questions. We tried to organize them a little bit. And I have one first question from Navam Niles that goes specifically to Andrea, our first speaker in the panel. And it's about education. And the question is, on average, we know that each additional year of schooling results in a 10% increase in GDP per capita. So losing about 2 years of education could have significant impact in the developing world. Are these research efforts to verify, are there research efforts that can verify these impacts? So SDGs also involving and comprising education as an important goal. So can you say something about that, or are there also trends that are counterintuitive and we should be aware of, especially regarding your in Southern Voice, Andrea?
Thank you, and thank you, Navam, for the question. I'm not particularly aware yet of research with this long-term lens that you mentioned, but I think that should definitely be in our agenda. I think that, and from what we've seen of researchers within our network working on, there's a lot of emphasis on trying to find some alternatives to the ongoing crisis, right? So a lot of the current questions, I think, are focused on how do we adapt the systems, the education systems to the crisis, and what will the education systems look in a new normal. And I think one of the interesting trends that we will see is more of this discussion of digital opportunities for education, and whether these ones are actually useful in solving some of these inequalities that we're seeing, or are they actually exacerbating them as well. So I think those are some of the current questions, and the long-term question is still there. And also in this digital aspect thing, I think one of the things we've seen, and some reflections that I've heard from colleagues, is that the crisis has also pointed out that some changes that were possible relatively quickly, right? So for example, for companies and providers of internet and digital services to lower their fees for access and to increase coverage to reach farther communities. That was something that in some countries was done relatively quickly, right? And so it's a lesson that some of these changes that have been asked for by civil society organizations and by experts of the need for making these, for example, digital services more accessible, are feasible, right? So following on Frank's comment, there are some maybe positive things that are shown that are possible when there's the will to do so.
Thanks so much, Andrea. So let me follow with a question from Prajal Pradhan from PIC. So it also relates to some of the positive assessments that Frank has already provided. So the question is to all panelists. So feel free to answer. So the question is, we can see that the COVID-19 pandemic also as an opportunity for sustainable transformation, although it has negatively impacted most sustainable development goals. And so can we see or can we envisage the COVID-19 pandemic also as a window of opportunity for sustainable transformation? And Prajal here provides some research insights on a Nepal case study, which is based on knowledge co-creation with around 400 experts, and which shows that the pandemic indeed has also opened a short-lived and narrow window of opportunity for sustainable transformation. So do you have similar types of insights from your respective countries? Who would like to start? Perhaps Asa, would you like to start?
Sure. I think that's a very good question, which, I mean, I think, let me put it like this. A year ago, I think I and many others were very pessimistic, more pessimistic in the sense of this pandemic came, what will happen to the sustainable development agenda, the climate agenda? It was just starting to move. And I think, so if we want to, highlight the positives here, is that we're still talking about these issues, and the political leaders still are. So I think that's actually a break compared with other crises in the past. I'm old enough to remember the financial crisis some 10 years ago, when I think there was more of this, the business cycles goes down and then you don't feel like you can afford prioritizing sustainable development. So I think we're in a different place now, which is good. But a window of opportunity, yes, in theory. And I think with some changes, definitely here in Sweden, I think business travel is gonna stay low after the pandemic, for example. Maybe some other consumption patterns change. But in practice, we have to be honest, we're not really seeing that this opportunity is being taken with regards to, for example, these economic recovery packages, which to a large extent still go to fund various, fossil fuel production or very fossil intensive infrastructure. So I think, yes, it's not too late. Let's hope we really catch, take this opportunity, but it still looks challenging, I think.
Okay, thanks a lot, Asa. Is there any other panelist who would like to also cover some aspects of this question, bringing in another perspective from other countries, maybe? Yeah, Joe, please go ahead.
I can't say anything very different. It's just that, this is history. This is how it goes. Catastrophes always provide an opportunity for a new beginning. It's very unfortunate, but it's the way it goes. So, this particular catastrophe, I don't know if it has the characteristics of different from previous ones. We have to choose. It's going to be it all comes down to power, frankly. So I've come to believe in my age. It all depends on whether the powers in government, whether the communities, whether the subnational governments, etc., what their interests are. I mean, in the UK, you see these interests playing off with one another. The UKC has a self-image of being a leader internationally in climate policy, which is a good thing. How deep it goes is a long debate, but that combined with the fact that governments typically look for big spending packages at this point in a Keynesian theory in order to get the economy going again means that probably in the UK, there will be resources going into renewable energy and alternative transportation in 2021 and 2022 that wouldn't be going into it otherwise. So in that respect, it's positive. But of course, it varies from country to country. And I'm not convinced that the pandemic is going to lead. I don't know myself whether it's going to lead to long-term changes in the way we're thinking, or whether it's just going to be an interruption in the pathway in which we've been going. Remember, before the pandemic, we were heading towards still running away from multilateralism. And it's unclear whether the pandemic hasn't been a great time for multilateralism, has it? So the question for me now is there going to be more international cooperation on stuff? Or is there going to be skepticism towards the new US government because another US government may come in 3.5 years? So there's a lot of uncertainties. There's opportunities. It's up to good people on webinars like this to seize the time simply. It's not going to happen for us. This is an opportunity. We have to realize that. However you do it, at your university, in your town, or if you have an influence on your national politicians, do it. This is an opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. We actually prepared this positive, or the question on positive results from the COVID-19 crisis for the SDGs for the very last round of questions, but now it came from the audience, which is also nice. And I think there's a nuanced perspective. It's, again, glass half full or half empty. I have another question from the audience, which looks in the future. It asks whether the panel, so the speakers, expect a new version of the SDGs to come after the current Sustainable Development Agenda. And would that make sense if the SDGs apparently lack steering effects? Let's put it to Frank first. So what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, depends, of course, on the question to what extent the SDGs will have any effect from now till 2030. I did not present findings of the SDG midterm assessment because it's a little bit too early. We're still fine-tuning the final findings, but we will present them over the course of this year. But my gut feeling is that the findings will not be that we will say that the SDGs have been a major success story. I think it's not that we found a lot of impact of the SDGs on global governance, national governance, and local governance. You find clusters of influence, you find certain areas where the SDGs really have shaped the behavior of certain actors at the local level, for example, in some cities, for example, in Utrecht, where we are based, for example, I would say the SDGs had an impact, but not on the global level. So I think the big ambition and the idea that the SDGs are really shaping and reshaping the way how our societies and our political systems function, this big ambition and this vision has not played out. So then the question is, first of all, the question is, there's still 9 years to go, so we can always be optimistic that it will be better. So maybe I'm too pessimistic here. Then the question is more concretely, will they be continued? And this is the question, how cynical are people according to the political developments and the future of political developments? I'm sometimes believing and sometimes afraid that the SDGs have actually an impact, which is not necessarily a positive one, which could potentially be the impact of legitimization of non-action. So that in a way, people believe the SDGs are out there, governments are talking about them, industry is talking about them, any major corporation is talking about the SDGs, so that you create a smokescreen of activities, glossy brochures, websites, and all kind of activities that are not matched by action. And then if this would be true, then it would mean that the SDGs have actually even a negative impact because they kind of minimize engagement, they minimize active transformative change, but they could help those in power to kind of hide non-activity and non-action. So the cynical answer could be this all could lead to the situation that we continue with SDGs because they help certain actors to hide inactivity and hide non-action and hide non-transformative change. So it could be well possible. But I believe that as a governance mechanism at the global level, there is limited evidence so far that the SDG governing through goals, non-binding goals on this broad terrain, that this is really changing the world. This is not really borne out by evidence in the last 6 years.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Unfortunately, time is up already. We could have continued the discussion, I think, for much longer. And I very much hope that there will be a chance to meet you in the next informal meeting in the Zoom room. So please click on the link in the chat. You're all invited, of course. I would like to, before we go to the other room, would like to thank again all the panelists for your insights, for your time, for answering the questions from the audience. There are still many questions that could have not answered, but yeah, we might do so in the informal session. We'd also like to thank our host, Gustav Tungren, for the introduction and hosting this event, and the International Project Office, as well as Jane Butler and Leonie Grob that helped organizing this event. And thanks, of course, for your questions and all attendees for your attention. This webinar today has been meant as a kickoff event for the series that starts or continues next month on May 25. We have the next session on global governance and the SDGs. And here, Marianne Beisheim and Stephen Bernstein, that many of you, I guess, know, will take part in the discussion. And it's exactly in 4 weeks from now and same time. And last but not least, I again invite you, anybody who is interested in the just curious about the ESG SDG task force, to join our informal Zoom meeting by clicking on the link in this chat. Thanks again, and hope to see you now in the Zoom room or in 4 weeks at the next webinar.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Karan. And see you all for the after panel party now in the other room.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to the panel.